This episode of the Toby Talks podcast is a conversation with Dr. Colin Swearingen. Dr. Swearingen is a professor of political science at John Carroll University who focuses on American politics, elections, campaign strategies, and polling. Dr. Swearingen and I discuss a number of topics surrounding the 2024 presidential election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, which is less than a month away. Crazy to think about. I hope that you will find this conversation fruitful, engaging, and walk away from it saying, I learned something. I want to thank Dr. Colin Swearingen for his time. I love the conversation. It was very interesting, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure our audience will too. If you feel that I have earned your like and subscription, I humbly ask that you please do so. Thank you, and enjoy the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to do this podcast with me. I greatly appreciate it. First, I thought we could start off with maybe explaining who you are.
Sure thing, Toby. I'm grateful to be on the podcast. So, I'm Dr. Colin Swearingen. I'm a professor of political science here at John Carroll University. I grew up here in Cleveland, in the Cleveland area, born at University Hospitals in downtown, so very familiar with it. But spent some time, going to school, went to undergraduate at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. Then I did my graduate work at the University of Oklahoma. And so while I was working on the PhD, one thing led to another, and it ended up working at the Oklahoma House of Representatives. So I was a nonpartisan staffer, meaning that I actually worked on various committees in the Oklahoma House, helped Democrats and Republicans answer questions, constituent questions. But my main job, certainly for the first couple of years, was to focus on redistricting. So I redistricted the state of Oklahoma for the House, worked on the congressional districts, and did some other redistricting for school council, school boards, county commissioners, and things like that. So worked there for 3 years before coming here to John Carroll. It was a great homecoming, and I've been here since August of 2012.
What's that work like when you're going around redistricting? Are you going to specific areas? How do you draw those lines? I feel like that's such a complex thing to think
It really
about.
is. So it's actually kind of cool because there are now a lot of apps out there that allow you to get a little bit of that experience. Dave's redistricting app is a great one, but the technology that we use goes a little bit deeper than what's available through that particular app. It really, so we did a couple different things. Number one is we spent about a year building up the redistricting effort. So what we did is started working on different population projections, looking at what the Census Bureau was showing county populations to be, trying to get an understanding for where some of the trouble areas would be, where are we losing population in Oklahoma, where are we growing the fastest. We also started working with the Speaker's office to kind of pave things for the actual redistricting process. So are we going to do a steering committee? Are we going to do just a full committee? How is that going to work? A lot of that's a little legislative nuance and things like that. But basically, we set up a team of people that would help make some of the key decisions. Some of the elected officials would make those decisions, and then as staff, we would operate by those. So, for instance, one of the recommendations that the steering committee made was that we're not going to use election data in the redistricting data. So if anybody, Democrat or Republican, wants to look at the partisan breakdown of their new district or certain precincts, certain areas, they would have to go to someplace off-site from the Capitol building, somewhere else where they would look at that information. And they could then come and talk to us about what they would want, what they didn't want. But from my job, my standpoint, we don't know what that is. Exactly. So the redistricting committee, when it kicked off, adopted those recommendations. We also traveled around the state of Oklahoma, having open hearings so that people could share their input on redistricting, what they would want to see, what they wouldn't want to see. And one of the things that we heard from people in central Oklahoma was, if you look at the demographic changes in Oklahoma, Canadian County, it's west of Oklahoma City, was the fastest growing county in the state. And after the previous redistricting, they had all these districts fingering in there to take little bits of population. And they said, we don't actually have much representation in this county. We are the fastest growing county. We are the, I think, third or fourth largest county in the state. And we're really underrepresented because so many legislators live outside the county, but their district moves up into ours. So we wanted to make sure that we remedied that at least a little bit by giving them additional representation. So we would listen to different people. We went out to, northeast Oklahoma, we did central Oklahoma, we did western Oklahoma, we did southeast Oklahoma. We did one live streamed from the Oklahoma House chambers, so that way people could watch it and they could email us and send feedback in that way. So really it was a combination of listening to people in the state and then trying to have what I would consider good governance practices. And then once we began drawing the maps, it was listening to each of the legislators, Democrat and Republican, in terms of what they wanted, what they didn't want, and trying to make sure that we had as fair of a map as possible while improving upon what we felt were some of the deficiencies from the previous map.
That's pretty cool. So transitioning here to John Carroll, what are some of the classes that you teach here at John Carroll?
Yeah, so it shouldn't surprise you to learn that I teach American politics. So I teach our U.S. politics class here. I also teach classes on legislative politics, executive politics, elections, but I also teach our statistics stuff. So our political science research methods, our political analysis class, which counts for the quantitative analysis class in the core year. But since I came to John Carroll, I actually got embedded into the Honduras immersion. And so I've been doing that since I arrived here at John Carroll. So I also teach a class on healthcare access in Latin America. Oh, wow. So it's not something that I took classes on when I was in graduate school or even undergrad, but coming to John Carroll, being involved in that immersion, working in public health down in Honduras has led me to learn a lot about what goes on there. So that's kind of one of those random courses you end up developing over time.
Yeah,
so
that's very interesting. So I have a lot of I'm pre-med, so I have a lot of friends who've gone on that Honduras trip, and they always talk about how amazing and great of an experience it was. So that's pretty cool to hear that we have that kind of connection there.
Yeah.
So going into some of those classes, you obviously talk about elections and American politics and the statistics behind it. Excuse me. One of the things that I'm sure that you cover in those classes is election polling, and we're less than a month away from an election, which is crazy to think about. And this one is very unique because we have two candidates who are trying to argue against one another, as one of them being the incumbent. And I think something that I've read, and I wanted to get your thoughts on, is that it seems to me that whoever can take the mantle of being the leader of change is probably going to end up winning this election.
Yeah.
And it's very weird because we have Vice President Kamala Harris, who's not the president, so she's trying to claim that she's maybe not the incumbent, and a former president who's running again for president, so it's a very unique election in that way. I guess the first question I want to go over, maybe you can add on to that if you'd like, is how much should we trust the polling today?
Oh, so that's a really good question.
Yeah.
I see that happen in classes. That question comes up. I see it when I'm watching different things, looking at social media, reading different articles. I think, it's important to recognize that polling has strengths and weaknesses, right? So one of the strengths of polling is that you can get a pretty good idea as to what people think about within a margin of error. The difficulty with elections is that you're judged as a pollster how well you do by if you get the winner right.
Right.
So you could say, in 2016, that, in the state of Wisconsin, you think that Hillary Clinton's going to win by 1%.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump wins by less than 1%. Well, your margin, you're
in the margin
within
of
2% of getting it right.
Right.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
You got the wrong winner.
Yeah.
And so people hold that against you.
Right.
It's like, okay. Now, the problem we see with polling, especially in 2016 and 2020, and even to a certain extent 2022, is when polls systematically underestimate support for one particular party or candidate. And so, of course, polls tend to be a little bit off. Historically, it's gone back and forth. I think it's underestimated just with the 2016 and 2020. It's underrepresented Republican support a little bit more in terms of recent years.
Yes.
But 2012, it underestimated Barack Obama support.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting to see that there's no way of knowing until after the election if the pollsters are getting it wrong. And again, since you're judged on getting the correct result, if I ask people, what do you think about Taylor Swift? And there are polls out there that ask people, about Taylor Swift. You could say, 55% of people like Taylor Swift and think she's great, and 45% of people either don't know or don't care or don't like her. Okay, well, what does that really mean?
Right.
Like, you could be within 5 to 10%, and it's not going to be, this big referendum on your ability to do your job as a pollster.
Right.
But when you have this election. So what do we take away from polling right now? Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that, there's a degree of uncertainty.
Right.
with every single poll that you see. There's the margin of error. But on top of the margin of error, we need to understand that pollsters are making key decisions once they take all those survey responses, deciding how do they weight the poll. Traditionally, they will weight based on race. They will weight based on age. They might weight based on party identification. But one of the questions right now that they're trying to figure out is, do we weight based off of recall from 2020 presidential election? Arguing that there's just it's hard to get Trump supporters measured in a poll.
Yeah.
So if we keep underestimating his support, we need to find a way to then get those results weighted so that it reflects the actual electorate. Traditionally, pollsters have avoided doing that weight based on recall. They'll just simply ask a question: who did you vote for in 2020? Respondent tells them, and then they try to say, okay, nationally, this is where Biden was, this is where Trump was, we want the results to look like that. Problem is, people forget. People lie. We know that people like to say that they voted for the winner. So what you might say is, a lot of people might say they voted for Biden even if they voted for Trump, and because they say in their recall they voted for Biden when they actually voted for Trump, you end up raising Trump's share of the vote in some of these polls weighted based on recall. That could inflate his level of support in the polling.
Yeah.
Now, there are reasons not to do that, but is it necessarily wrong? Maybe not. But that's something that pollsters are trying to do. And some pollsters, if you look at them, they do that. Right now, other pollsters are not. And so you actually see a little bit of a different story in polling right now in 2024 based on whether the pollsters are weighting based on 2020 recall or they're weighting it based on a variety of other factors and not on 2020 recall.
So something interesting that you brought up is the last, I think 8 years, 12 years now, that Trump has entered into politics, his support has been underestimated by the polls. In 2016, it was one of the biggest modern upsets we've had against Secretary Hillary Clinton. And and in 2020, I read a stat, I don't know how accurate this is, maybe you can attest to this, that 2020 was the largest error in polling that we've had in 40 years. That overestimated Joe Biden's support by 3.9 percentage points. Just some stats, just to give the audience some stats on this. Today, October 11th, 4 years ago, the polls showed that Biden was leading by 7.2 points in Michigan, 4.5 points, and he won that state by only 2.8 points. He was leading in the polls 4 years ago today in Pennsylvania, 4.5 points, and only won by 1.2. In Georgia, 1 to 2 point lead, won by 0.2 points. Nevada, 5 to 6 point lead, won the state by 2.4 points. North Carolina led the state by 1 to 2 points, lost by 1.3. Wisconsin, 6 to 7 points lead, and only won the state by 0.6. And just so the audience know, talking about those specific states because those are the states that are going to determine the election, especially the Rust Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think those are Pennsylvania specifically are going to be the ones that really determine who's the next president of the United States. So and then in 2016, again, he was not favored to win that election.
Nope.
Not at all. I'm sure I think I've read a stat that said 70% chance he was going to win, or Clinton was going to win that election. What has led to this underestimating of support for Trump? Why do you think people, when someone calls, are like, I'm just going to say I'm voting for this person, or I'm not going to comment? Why is it so hard to poll Trump supporters?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one obviously that pollsters are still dealing with today. So let's break it down, 2016, then 2020, and then take a look at what it means for today. So I actually think there are two different reasons. 2016 and 2020, even though Trump was the common denominator in both of those, there were different reasons why pollsters got things wrong in each election, which is kind of interesting because, once you take a look at getting something wrong and then you try to compensate for that, doesn't mean that you're actually getting the full picture. So in 2016, I think one of the problems that pollsters had was identifying likely voters. There were a lot of people who voted for Trump that typically didn't vote.
Yeah, so the non-college educated
Correct.
white voter, blue collar.
And usually, if you look at 2008 versus 2012. So the roots of some of these polling errors have come from prior elections. So 2008 to 2012, turnout goes down.
Right.
Now, Mitt Romney came closer to winning than John McCain.
Yeah.
But McCain got more votes than Romney. You look at some analysis and you look at where those votes and how they were distributed. They weren't just equally distributed across the country. There were certain pockets of the country, particularly in the Midwest and in some of the more rural parts of the Northeast, like Western New York, Central New York, Upstate New York, Central Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, that had more decline in turnout relative to other areas. And so what you saw was that there was this segment of voters who voted for McCain that didn't vote for Romney. When you think about polling and you ask somebody, okay, are you going to vote in the 2016 presidential election? One of the things you want to determine is, did they vote in 2012? We know that voting is habitual. People who voted the most recent election are more likely to vote in this election. But if they didn't, then you might discount their likelihood of voting. So when pollsters are collecting the information, they say, okay, how am I going to work out what we call the likely voter screen? We're going to ask a series of questions and we're going to determine if they're likely voters. They may not have reached likely voter or past that likely voter screen. We also saw quite a few voters go for Obama in 2008, Obama 12, Trump in 16. Well, you may have
saw that
missed
in
some of
Ohio a lot.
In many places in the Mahoning Valley, for instance. And you saw it in Wisconsin and Michigan and some of those rural and small towns. And so were you getting those voters, or were you, getting high propensity voters that may not have liked Trump, even though, they lived in maybe some of those communities? So it's very difficult. So they underrepresented the white working class in 2016. And they did it because their samples were skewed and they didn't know it. And that's tough sometimes to know ahead of time. In 2020, we had a pandemic, right? And people are sitting at home. And people were interested in talking about politics, and they would get a phone call and they're like, well, I haven't really talked to anybody today, so I'm going to talk to this pollster. And so, people were willing to do that, but who was more willing to talk? And so this is the problem you run into with polling is, when you call a household, you want to get a random adult. We know that people who answer the phone are different than those who don't. I'm an introvert. Odds of me answering the phone if I don't know who the number is, very low. If I'm a chatterbox, though, I might pick up the phone and just go, hey, why not? And if it's during a pandemic and I'm lonely, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to talk to somebody, right? And so what you end up seeing is that there were a lot of people, college-educated voters, who wanted to talk about politics, who were willing to take the survey. And there were a lot of people who just let the phone ring and didn't answer it. And the people who answer the phone were more likely to be Biden supporters. People less likely to take the surveys, Trump supporters. And so the pandemic dynamic affected how survey researchers were doing their polls, and it led to that polling error. And it's fascinating because 2016, the national polls were pretty close. Clinton's going to win by 2-3%. She won by 2-3%. But of course, the error came with those Midwestern states. In 2020, the error was, I think, more systematic. It was at the national level, and it was at some of those states that you mentioned earlier.
I think something that's also interesting about the Trump movement and his way into politics is, in 2016, you could argue that what won him the election was the white, non-college educated voter who came out and turned out for him that usually wouldn't turn out, say for Mitt Romney. And then and he also actually won the white suburban woman vote as well. In 2016, he won the suburban white woman vote by 52% compared to Hillary Clinton's 44%. In 2020, there was a notable shift. Biden actually won that group by 55%, and Trump was actually 44%. In 2024, what do you think? You could also say that in 2020 he had, I don't have the stat on this, but I know that for a Republican, he got more votes than what's usually expected for minorities to vote for Trump. So what do you think in 2024 who should Trump's campaign be focusing on to get to the poll or to get to the ballots for him?
It's a great question because at this point, right, you got less than 4 weeks left in the race. We're talking about trying to get the right voters to the polls if you're a campaign. Like, how do we get our supporters to the polls? So Let's back up. Let's back up to the 1780s. We'll talk about the Constitutional Convention, right? The idea that Madison has is, okay, look, we have this pluralist society where we have all these different groups of people, and they have to vote, and they elect people to govern, and within that, you have these different branches of government that have to continually build a coalition. The coalition that elects one person president in 1 year, 4 years later is going to look different, even if that same person is on the ballot.
Yes.
So you mentioned the shift among college-educated suburban women voters. Well, it's possible that Trump does even worse among them in 2024 than he did in 2020, even though he won that group in 2016. But he's making gains elsewhere.
Right.
So where is he making gains? You mentioned minority populations.
Yeah.
We know that Trump did reasonably well with Latino voters. He didn't win Latino voters, but he did better than pretty much any Republican, with possibly the exception of Bush in 2004. Okay, so there's a hypothesis now that's generated. Okay, are we seeing a broader trend? Many people argue yes. There are others that say, okay, maybe it's that Latino voters like clearly defined presidents, and that's Trump's the incumbent. They're going to vote for the incumbent. They're comfortable with him. The issue with that take is that you look at Republican gains in places like the Rio Grande Valley that were taking place even when Trump himself wasn't on the ballot. And that continued forward in 2022. There's been special elections where you see Republicans doing better in some of these Latino communities outside of, say, South Florida. But even in South Florida, you've seen, Ron DeSantis doing very well in Miami and Dade County. Broward County, not so much because it's whiter. So there's been a movement there. There's been small movements in some urban areas. So Philadelphia, Detroit. We're not talking about Donald Trump winning the city of Philadelphia, but we're talking about Donald Trump going from 5 to 10% to 10 to 12 to 15%. Well, that's meaningful because in a swing state like Pennsylvania, you have huge margins that Democrats tend to get with cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. If those margins go down, they have to make up those votes elsewhere. And maybe they do in Lancaster County because that's more educated, a little bit wealthier, and those voters are trending Democratic. Maybe they do it in Montgomery or Chester counties, but maybe Burke County is continuing to move a little bit further to the right. Like there's all this stuff that's changing. So if I'm the Trump campaign and I'm thinking about who do we get to the polls, and we know that they're focusing on this, they're focusing on trying to get low propensity voters at the polls, which takes more effort than people who are what we call high propensity voters. Democrats have made inroads among college-educated and wealthier voters over the last couple of cycles, so those people are more likely to vote. We see that outcome happen in special elections. Democrats have done well because those are high propensity voter elections. Is Trump's name and presence on the ballot enough to get some of these voters to the polls? Yes, but they need to continue to delve into that. So it's going into communities and making sure that people are, not only are you registered, that time has passed for most states, but okay, what's your plan to vote? You will see Trump doing rallies in unconventional areas. In battleground states, also in states that aren't battlegrounds. He's doing a Madison Square Garden. He's doing it in Coachella. Why? Well, part of the argument would be he's trying to get some of these places, voters turning out in tough congressional districts, so that Republicans might be able to maintain control of the House of Representatives. But also, I think he's trying to send a signal. Like, I'm going to go to areas that Republicans have ignored. I'm going to campaign in them to show people it's okay to vote Republican if you're African American. It's okay if you are Latino. Vote for Republican.
I think they've done a really good job at making Trump more digestible. You know what I mean? Like, 2016, it was just like if you were like a Trump supporter, like you were looked like in a certain way. Whereas in 2024, I feel like even he himself, you look at some of his like debate moments from 2016, he's kind of toned it down a lot compared to what it's still like out there, but it's pretty toned down from if you look at what he was in 2016. So I think that's been a part of the campaign strategy, is to make him more accessible to more Americans. As when 2016, it was very a niche group of Americans that liked him and liked those personality qualities of him. Whereas in 2024, it seems to be a more tamed, more presidential. He's not always going to be that way, but seems to be more taking this more mature route, and I think it's made him more accessible to the average voter.
Yeah, I mean, you can take a look at his rhetoric. I mean, he still says crazy things. But at the same time, he's been president.
Yeah.
So then one of the challenges that anybody who hasn't been president has when they campaign for the office is
very true.
How do you project presidential
Right.
race?
Yeah.
Well, if you've been president, it's a lot easier to do because people
Yes.
have seen you in
Yes.
front of the seal.
Yes.
And so he
Yes.
has that. And so people
Yeah.
are like, okay, well, I know what Trump is. Now, that can work against you, right? Because people are
Right.
like, I remember when you were president, and
Yeah.
maybe I didn't like it this much.
Right.
But there, you read interviews with people, and I know it's anecdotal, and it comes from, a lot of journalist experience. But I think journalists do a very good job, by and large, of like drilling down into kind of encapsulating maybe some of the stuff we see.
Yeah.
Latino voters will talk about Trump like, look, he had an economy that was working, and
Yes.
Republicans were keeping jobs open, states open, schools open. Democrats weren't. And so I want my kids to be going to school.
Right.
I want them in school. I don't want them sitting at home.
Right.
I'm working. I have a job. I can't oversee their education. And so, there's an element there among some voter groups. And I think that helped him. And that's one reason why he made some inroads among certainly Latino voters. I think, the one difficulty is, it's easy to go in on new groups and try to poach voters.
Right.
But it's also, what are you giving up? There's always a trade-off.
Right.
I like to say that there's an element of Newtonian physics when it comes to electoral coalitions. There is an opposite reaction. There may not be an equal reaction, but there's an opposite reaction. And so what are you giving up? How many college-educated suburban voters are leaving the Republican Party as Trump is engaging in this rhetoric, or as Trump is going after voters that don't traditionally vote Republican?
Right.
There's a cost to it.
Yeah, I've seen that criticism that he's swaying away from what won him 2016 and trying to, and I thought that's a very interesting argument, and I don't know if it's the right argument or not, but I have seen that where it's he's like, this is what won him 2016. Why is he going away from that in 2020?
And one answer, and we won't know until after the election, right? But one answer would be, well, the coalitions are shifting.
Yes.
And he knows, look, people out there that are educated, that are suburban, that are wealthier, they know Trump. They know whether they like him or not.
Yeah.
But there's this opportunity out here that as the Republican Party moves closer to, working class voters and populism, as the Democrats become maybe increasingly the party of the elite, that there's this, there's this new group of voters that could be cycled into voting Republican maybe for the first time ever. And the challenge is, how do you grow that coalition large enough to be a governing coalition? Now, I say all that, and I'm going to maybe throw a wet blanket on it. And if you take a look at Trump's support, he had roughly 46% of the vote in 2016. I think Hillary Clinton was at 48%. Trump gets 47% in 2020. So yes, you're bringing in new voters, but your coalition is no bigger than it was in previous elections when you lost.
Yes.
What helped Trump in 2016, third-party voters, the existence of them, that went down. Biden predominantly benefited. Biden got over 50%. The last time a Republican got over 50% of the popular vote, George W. Bush, 2004. The last time before that, 1988. 92, 96, 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, Republicans have not received a majority of the popular vote. The Republican Party has to figure out, how do you grow what Trump has done? How do you keep those voters but reach back out to some of the voters that he turned away from the Republican Party? With Trump on the ballot, that's difficult to do. The question for me in November is, can Trump break 48%? And is that enough to win? And I think it's going to be very, very close.
You brought up the popular vote. I actually have a question. Polymarket is marketing betting for who's going to win, a forecast of who's going to win the election. They have right now Donald Trump, as we're speaking, October 11th at 2:11 p.m. Donald Trump at 53.6% to win the election. Kamala Harris at 45.6% to win the election. Kamala Harris to win the popular vote, I think, is 77% right now on there. So that kind of shows you the discrepancy between the two. How much should we trust the markets, and what is their role to play in this, and with the polls?
I think the markets are a good indicator in some ways, depending on the market, right? So polyvote, we know, had a big spike for Trump, and people kind of say, well, Elon Musk, said something about, poly markets, and therefore, it shot up. Okay. But the markets are kind of indicative of odds. If you look at the markets, they're fairly close to what some of the models, the election forecasting models that data journals that bring out there, whether it's Nate Silver, 538.com, Election Decision Desk HQ, like The Economist. They're all kind of, it's right around a 50-50. Like one might say Trump has a 47% chance, the other one 53%. Like you're splitting hairs at that point, given the uncertainty into the models. So I think that they're reasonable. I think it's one bit of information that might be okay. If you're looking for something that's not poll-driven, that might be a little bit more on trends or vibes, and more people might be willing to put their money, okay. But know that it can be manipulated.
Right.
The same way that election forecasts can be manipulated based on your assumptions and what kind of data you want to prioritize.
Yeah, your bias. Yeah.
Then sometimes it's just tough decisions.
Right.
But they all have strengths. They all have weaknesses.
Yeah.
I think you just want to make sure you're aware of those before putting your weight into them.
Right. So going into that, what do you think the polls are telling us right now about the election in less than a month?
It's super close.
Super close.
I mean, like, I saw Harry Enton at CNN today. Just a real quick 2-minute clip. 3 weeks ago, Vice President Harris is up just marginally in some of those key Midwest battleground states. Now, CNN and Harry Enton has it at about 1% Harris advantage across, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. That's really, really close. And at that point, it becomes, are we assuming the right electorate? Are we, weighting things correctly to get the, representative sample? Like all those things come down. Like you can give. They did this. The New York Times did this. Nate Cohn, I think it was in 2016 or 2020. I think it was 2016. But they took 4 different pollsters. They collected information. They gave 4 different pollsters the same response, same respondent, same information, and they all came across different results. It was for the state of North Carolina. One pollster had Trump up 4 in North Carolina. Another pollster had Clinton up by like 3 or 4 in North Carolina, and some, the other 2 were in between. You can get the same. You can call the same people, and a pollster can give you different results based on the different assumptions and methodology they have. Doesn't make them wrong. It's just how they view it, how they view weighting, how they view likely voter screens, like how they put all that stuff together. So it's on top of the already existing margin of error. So when you've got a 1-point advantage for one candidate across multiple battleground states that we all generally think are going to be the deciding states, gosh, man, that's close. Yeah. I mean, it's a very, very strong chance that we won't know on Wednesday, November 6th, who the president of the president-elect is.
Wow.
Just because it's going to be super close. And not that it's going to be litigated, not that we're talking about, the Electoral Count Act that does the Supreme Court get involved, but just genuinely.
Like recounting. And...
some of these, or we just got to wait for some of these, the ballots to be counted that were mailed in, that arrived on Election Day. In Ohio, they have to be postmarked the day before the Election Day, but that doesn't mean they're going to arrive on Election Day, right? It could take a day or 2.
Right.
So you've got, each state has their different deadlines for when those ballots have to be in hand. And so we might just have to be waiting on, Detroit to count ballots in Wayne County or, in some place like that.
I remember in 2020, I was like, my parents were watching, we were watching. I was like, I'm not going to sleep until we know who it is because I just want to know. And I remember I woke up the next morning. It was like 7 a.m. My mom wakes me up. I'm still on the couch. The TV's still on, and they still haven't been able to count the votes because they're still coming in. So I actually I think we have classes on Wednesdays right after. Which is I don't know how I'm going to go to class.
Same here.
I'm going to be anxious trying to see.
Yeah.
Because it's
just refresh. Yeah. So, it's crazy because, I did the same thing in 2000, right? Which.
Oh, that one.
So, if I didn't go to bed until we knew who won that, I actually would lose a month of sleep, right? Because it was so close. And so,
that's the Al Gore election.
That was, Bush Gore, you have 530 some odd votes in Florida. You also had, people don't remember this. It was Florida, but, Oregon was, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 votes separating the two of the candidates. There was 4,000 votes separating the two of them in New Mexico. West Virginia was reasonably close. New Hampshire was really close. There were states, Wisconsin was, I think, 11,000 votes. You're talking about really small margin in a number of states.
Right.
And so, they're going to count. At some point, the people counting ballots go home.
Yeah.
They take a break, right? And so it's like, I could be sitting there at noon refreshing, but it's like, they're not going to update until the afternoon, right? So, there is, and by the way, it may not happen at the presidential level, but it always happens on the congressional level. Like there was New York, 2020, I think 2022.
Yeah.
There was one race, I think it was the 24th Congressional District. We just didn't know for a month or two after. Like it was 2 months after. Congress is already doing their thing. We're already trying to figure out who the speaker is going to be. And of course, that was the Kevin McCarthy, McCarthy going to be speaker.
I remember.
They didn't have anybody.
Yeah.
Because New York was still trying to figure out. It was going through litigation and judges and all this stuff and trying to figure out who's going to be the representative to Congress for that particular district.
Yeah.
So, it happens every single time.
Yeah.
It may not happen at the presidential level. And, you look at states that I think are notoriously bad at counting. New York, California are the worst states. Fortunately, the presidential race isn't going to come down to those two states.
Yeah.
But Congress might. And we may not be losing control of Congress for weeks, maybe even a month after that, because of the way they count their votes.
And that's really interesting. So we know it's going to be really close. Both campaigns, I think, I've seen them. I know Vice President Harris was on a very famous podcast, Call Her Daddy, really famous among women. Trump was just on a podcast called Flagrant with a very famous comedian named Andrew Schultz. They're all going on. I know Vice President Harris just did a town hall. She was on The View. President Trump is making his rounds doing these rallies. He just did one in Butler again, where the assassination attempt. It was supposedly really big. Looking at their campaigns, what are some positives that they can be proud about going into November 6th, and what are the negatives and what can they improve on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Yeah. So I think, first of all, we need to make clear that, a lot of the stuff that we see the day in, day out may not make a difference in the end, right? So political scientists and campaigns kind of take different views on some of the day in, day outs of a campaign. Some of the political scientists don't think campaigns matter. We do. Yeah. But we also know that people will obsess over the small details of, did this particular campaign stop, or did this answer on The View or 60 Minutes, is that going to change? Yeah. By and large, no. Yeah. But in an election so close, these kinds of things are more likely to make a difference. Right. And I think it's interesting to see, there is some research that indicates that, there can be a short-term boost for a candidate when they go to a particular area because they get favorable media coverage. Yeah. Nationally, not as much, but locally, yes. Local news coverage comes in, people are like, oh yeah, they have an opportunity to go. They might talk to people who went to rallies. So it's kind of interesting, but now, short-term bumps, right? So it's about engaging voters. I think one of the most important things, if I'm Trump, what are some successes that Trump's had? Well, I think Trump has had some success in cultivating his coalition among working class voters. I think that that has helped. I think he's done a good job of holding on to some key constituencies from 2016 to 2020, particular evangelical voters. Yeah. I think he's done a better job in terms of just anticipating and executing a campaign on the day-to-day. His campaign staff really knows their stuff. Yeah. And I think they've done a good job with that. Yeah. However, they've not handled the transition from running against Biden to running against Harris. Yeah, that's been very bad. Very rocky. Very uncertain. How do we attack her? What do we do? What do we say?
You could immediately tell. Yeah, immediately. The things that he was speaking about, I remember when he went to the Black Journalist Conference and he was speaking, he was attacking her. Oh, she doesn't know what race she is, and so they don't know where to go from there. They're trying to give her. He has 3 nicknames for her because he loves his nicknames.
He does,
but he hasn't picked one. He's Lion Kamala, Comrade Kamala. He just hasn't figured out what his thing is. It was Sleepy Joe. Yeah. It was Crooked Hillary. Yeah. But for her, they've just been. It's been an adjustment period for them for sure.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's very evident you saw it in the debates.
Yes.
I think you see it in just the general campaign as what are we really grabbing onto to define Harris. So I think they have done a very poor job of that. Yes. On the Harris side, I think they've done a very good job of actually taking momentum and pacing that momentum out. I think you look at her coming out of the Biden step down and quickly consolidating that support, getting the endorsement that she needed. Yeah. Building that momentum. Taking her favorability ratings from what were low.
They were very low, and then
pretty reasonable.
Good. Yeah. It's very impressive.
And then they took that, okay, now we're going to announce the VP, then we're going to have the convention. They were able to ride that wave of positive momentum for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, since then, right, and it's been a few weeks since the Democratic convention, then you kind of run into an issue of, okay, what sustains you? Okay, we've got this sugar high. What comes next? I think that they've struggled with some of that.
Yeah.
I think that they've had a very good they've raised $1 billion in the weeks since she's been in the race. Like, that's incredible.
Pretty.
But do you overthink it? And then how do you, what are the weaknesses that Harris has? How do voters view her? What are some of the problematic areas, and how do you assuage some of those concerns?
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. I think there's also always an issue when you're taking a new candidate, putting them into an already existing apparatus. The candidate is going to want their people there.
Yes.
So there is some tension between the Harris people and the Biden people, and who do you bring in? You bring some of the Obama people, which they did, and some of that decision making. Again, political scientists would say, by and large, that's probably not going to make a big difference, just because they've got the ad wars going on, and they're doing just fine. There's an asymmetry with the number of ads that Harris is running in some of these battleground states compared to Trump, even though the law of diminishing marginal utility is in play, right? Like, at some point, going from the $200 million of ads to, it's not going to make a huge difference.
Right.
But they have an advantage. At this point, I think what both candidates should do, what are the issues that you have an advantage on? And are voters going to the polls, or are they filling out their absentee ballot, thinking about those issues that benefit that candidate? If people are sitting there looking at the economy as being a big issue, Trump seems to have an edge on the economy.
Yes.
But if people are going to the ballot and they're saying, you know what, I'm a female, I'm worried about abortion access, and I'm going to cast a vote based on abortion, even though the economy's big, that's an advantage for Harris.
Yeah, I think the polls, at least from what I've seen, are showing us that voters trust Trump more on the border, the economy, whereas Kamala Harris on, I know abortion and healthcare are huge.
And typically education.
Education is another one. Yeah, so it just depends on what matters to the American now and which one can display. Like I said, I think I read earlier today that whoever can take on the mantle of the candidate of change would probably win the election.
And, they both have history. Right?
Yes,
and
so that's what makes it so unique.
It makes it unique. I mean, think back to, historically, 1912. Like, you've got former President Roosevelt running against an incumbent President Taft and the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson. And it's like, okay, well, you've got two current or former presidents running. Then, of course, Grover Cleveland in the 1890s, as somebody who was a former president that won the nomination, and was able to win again. So there is, it's not common. But,
Yeah. Quick question. You were talking about, bumps. Do you think the debate, the vice presidential, I know that historically it hasn't had much of significance when it comes to who gets elected, but do you think that momentum swing with J.D. Vance, because I know, I don't want to say it was, it was unanimous, but even on CNN, if you're watching some of the coverage, it was pretty clear that J.D. Vance at least had some type of advantage, because talk about low favorability. His was very low, very low. And Tim Walz, I think one of the big reasons why he got the vice presidential nomination is because he started this weird, he attached this word weird to J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, and it really took off on social media. And I think, whether it was him, was the senator or the congressman from Arizona, who is another person that could have potential, is
Senator,
Kelly.
Yes,
Senator
Kelly. Mark Kelly.
And then Josh Shapiro. Then he beat them all out by for that candidacy or for that position. Do you think that debate had any swing in momentum at all?
I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
A couple reasons. Number one, typically when people vote for president, they're not thinking about the vice president nominee. Like, even if you go back to, say, 2008, like, okay, well, you've got John McCain, he's old. Sarah Palin, we don't trust her. Okay, great, but are people really saying, okay, I'm going to do this calculation where I think John McCain has X number of years left to live? No, people aren't thinking about that, right? So, Trump is old.
Yeah.
He's the new Biden, right? In that regard,
he's the oldest president behind Biden if he won the election.
So, but I don't think people are thinking of it that way. I think because they know, look, we can't predict when somebody's going to die. We know that, as you get older, the probability goes up. But we're not going to say, okay, J.D. Vance, man, he's got a 65% chance of being president if Trump's elected. That's not going to happen. So they vote based on who the presidential nominee is. And then we also know, just generally with debates, somebody could win. I mean, I think there was more of a consensus that Vance won. Yeah. But there's also a consensus that Harris won the presidential debate.
Yes, that's true. That's very true.
And when you look at just some of the polling, or when you look at some of those forecasting models, it's remarkable how stable they are. Yeah. And that some of them are trying to account for that potential bump, but others are saying, okay, like, what are we seeing with the polling? And we do see. Sometimes it goes up. Candidate wins the debate, but then it goes back down. Romney did a great job in the first debate in 2012. Yeah. That was a great bump for him, but it's short-lived. Right. It settles back down. Yeah. And in part because, really what you're doing in a campaign, right? And this goes back to some political science studies going to the 1940s. You just want to remind people of what party do you belong to? And if you can do that, then it's like, oh yeah, that's why I'm Republican, that's why I'm Democrat. Right. And so there might be these intermittent interruptions like, oh, I know I'm a Republican, but Harris did really well in that debate. Yeah. But at some point, a week later, you're like, yeah, but I'm a Republican. And the same thing with the vice presidential debate. You revert back to where you are. Yes. There are undecideds, right? Yes. And there are people that have a hard time making up their mind. And so, it's kind of interesting. But then they're the focal point of all these ads. They're the focal point of all the rallies and things like that.
Well, that's another question that I had, because there's a lot of talk about the undecided voter. That's who's going to decide, like, every election cycle. And I look around, and maybe it's just because of the bubble I'm in, like, I already know who I'm voting for. Almost everyone in my life knows who they're voting for. So, like, where are these undecided voters? And so I just feel like no matter what a campaign does, like, it's very rare that I feel like someone is going to be switched into, like, this is my candidate, this is who I'm going to vote for. Like, I had a few people in my life be like, I don't like Trump, I don't like Vice President Harris, I'm going to vote for RFK Jr. Like, those type of people, but, like, are you really going to vote for RFK Jr.? Like, probably not, especially, like, if he was not going to get on the ballot in a lot of states, and et cetera, et cetera. So where are these, like, undecided votes coming from? Who are they? How many of them are they? I feel like, I remember there was an SNL skit one time of, like, these undecided voters who, like, I forgot who did it. I remember it was just really funny, where it's just like these people who pretend to be undecided voters because they like the attention of what comes with it every 4 years and being interviewed and asked about their opinions and such. Where are these people? Are these people actually undecided? Yeah. It's just like, I know I just threw it.
It's a great question. So I mean, there are people who generally don't like the two political parties. There are people that consider themselves moderates. They're conservative on some issues, liberal on others. There are some people that don't like Trump. They might have been disaffected Republicans, but they don't like Harris. So they're kind of in this, like, well, where am I? Who do I vote for? And so, like, some of them are like, gosh, like, I know about these candidates. I just don't know. And I'm not going to know until I get in the ballot box. Or I'm sitting with my absentee and I'm deciding, They do exist. And there aren't a lot of them. I mean, there are, if you look at some political science studies, it might be somewhere between 7 and 10%. You take a look at polling suggested that's between, say, 3 and 5% in terms of undecided voters. It's not a lot of them. But the question then becomes, and we know this, people who are undecided, people who are not affiliated with a political party, are less likely to vote. So it could be that the people who end up voting are just those who already have their minds made up, by and large. Now, we know from exit polls that a certain segment of the population claims that they made up their mind in the last 7 days or last 24 hours or things like that. But it's a relatively small percentage of the population. I think there are also some people that are just kind of like, I have a feeling that I'm going to vote Trump or a feeling I'm going to vote Harris. But I wouldn't put it at 100%. I'd put it at 65%. And I'll vote for Trump as long as something weird doesn't happen. Or I vote for Harris as long as something weird doesn't happen. So I think those voters are out there. But one thing that we saw, like, a lot of times presidential elections, if you go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were fought along those lines. Like, who are the undecideds? Let's cater our messages to them. And then in 2002, 2004, the Bush campaign says, wait a second. It takes a lot. It takes a lot to convince somebody to vote for us when they may not be naturally inclined to do so. Yeah. It takes a lot to get them to the polls. What if we said, okay, who are the people that are likely to vote for us? And we worked on just making sure they voted. And so you end up with this new wave, new strategy, or not new, maybe it's rekindled strategy of, let's just find the people that already agree with us and make sure they vote for us. And if we do that, we increase turnout, and we don't have to put all of our eggs in the undecided basket. It doesn't mean we ignore the undecideds. It just means that we're actually going to go out. And, I remember, I think it was 2002, you have this moment watching, turnout numbers come in, and like turnout's high, and Democrats are like stoked, like, oh my gosh, this is great. Well, the election results start coming in, and like, oh, well, we thought high turnout was good for Democrats because it meant that low propensity working class voters were showing up at the polls.
Yeah.
What we actually saw was a bunch of Republicans who didn't normally vote came out to vote.
Yeah.
And at one point, James Carville on CNN puts a trash can on his head because he's just like, oh, I was so wrong. And he's like, I can't believe this. Like, I just never forget that moment. And in part, it's like, that's what it's about. It's a two-pronged strategy. There are undecided voters. They do exist. There might be a small number. You want to get them. But you really need to focus on making sure that the people that are likely to vote, that agree with you, are getting the polls. And that's where, Democrats might have a little bit of an advantage just because of some of the shift in coalitions favoring the Democrats being favored by increasingly college-educated voters, and Trump getting some of these working-class voters, new voters, people that aren't, engaged in politics all the time, making sure they get out to vote.
Yeah. You getting out to vote. I have one friend who will not be named. You know who you are.
A watcher of the podcast.
Yeah, hopefully. But this one friend, went in 2020, in line to go vote, and looked at the line and was like, I'm just not going to vote. Yeah. And just left. Yeah. He just I didn't want to wait in line. And he's like, I'm just going to tell everyone I voted, and then in a few months when everyone calms down, I'll just tell them, I did actually.
Hey guys, by the way.
Yeah, so I think that's a lot more people than what you would actually think it is that are like, the line's too long, I'm just not going to vote.
Yeah, it's definitely a reason.
So, so I think that's a good point. In 2020, we had a record-breaking voter turnout.
We did.
66.8% of eligible voters voted.
It's a good number. Yep.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to have a higher voting turnout this time around, or do you think we're going to go back to the average of what we usually were?
Maybe in between. Yeah. So I think obviously when we take a look at 2020, there were some advantages for voting.
The pandemic and
the pandemic. Many states changed some of the rules to allow people to vote easier from home. Yeah. Some states have kept with that. Some states have been like, okay, hey. Also, it was a pandemic. I mean, we know that turnout typically increases when people are upset with the way things are going.
Yes.
So, there's a reason why in 1992 we had high turnout. There was a recession. There was some discontent bubbling beneath the surface. You have a third-party candidate like Ross Perot that's kind of, giving this populist message, and people come out to vote for somebody who's a little bit different. Well, that's followed up by really the lowest eligible voter population turnout election, 1996, than we've had since the 1940s, at least the 1940s. Because people were okay, they were happy. So 2020 was, there were people that were, this is a pandemic, oh my gosh, I have nothing else to do, I'm going to go vote.
Yeah.
People that were concerned about Trump, people that were concerned about Biden.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the same extent here. Now, I do believe that the Democrats are more motivated or more fearful of a Trump presidency than Republicans are of a Harris presidency. One poll recently said, 52% of Harris voters would be angry if Trump was elected. 42% of Trump voters would be angry if Harris was elected. So a little bit of a difference there. Yeah. So I think that the lack of pandemic, maybe the relaxing of some of these rules, are just not people not worried about voting via mail in ballots. I think we see a little bit of reduction of turnout. Yeah. Does it equal the average? I think we might be a little bit above average because I do think people are concerned about the state of democracy, concerned about the economy, concerned about a variety of issues that get them to turn out to vote. That maybe wasn't really the case in say 1996 or 2000. But we saw 2004 we saw increased turnout. We saw increased turnout in 2008, lower turnout in 2012. 2016 was roughly the same. So it wouldn't shock me if we were around 2012, percentages, maybe 2008 percentages of turnout. And I don't have those voting eligible percentages from those years off the top of my head. But it wouldn't shock me if we're closer to that than we were, say, 1996 or, the lower end. So I think maybe a little above average.
You brought up the populist like movement and this like candidate.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was there's a third party candidate that was populist. But I think politics is like leaning towards that way, in both parties.
Yeah.
You can argue that Trump is the face of the right wing populist movement, whereas someone like Bernie Sanders might be the face of the left wing populist movement. Do you think we're going like the polling is showing us and the political atmosphere that we have, that more politicians should lean more into these populist movements? Or do you think, because I've also seen some people be like for example, President Biden is more of a moderate Democrat, and you could argue that's a reason why he won the election in 2020. And you could also argue that what won Trump the election in 2016 and he became this full force is that he kind of took a step away from traditional Republican politics and started his own populist movement.
Yeah.
I would argue that you could say that Bernie Sanders, if he was the Democratic candidate in 2016 against Trump, that he probably would have had a better chance of beating him. So again, like where do you think we're heading politically with this new populist movement resurging here?
Yeah, so I think it's like a reemergence, right? So let's again think historically. So we've got going back to Madison and coalitions. So let's understand that. Let's also understand that members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election. Yeah. They're going to do what's in their best interest to win re-election. Right. And if they don't, they're probably going to lose. We also know that parties exist to win elections. Parties will look at information and adjust. Now, along those lines, right, a couple things stand out. Number one, we've had populist and progressive movements in the past, going back to the 1890s. William Jennings Bryan, of course, was a populist candidate, and that was an in vogue thing. Now, Democrats, and he was a Democrat, didn't maintain that forever because it didn't work. Now, they did help spearhead the progressive movement in the early 1900s, and I think it culminated, you look at 1912, you had Teddy Roosevelt running as a progressive, you had Woodrow Wilson running as a progressive, and then you had the incumbent president, Taft, running as kind of a traditional Republican. Taft got, I think, 39 electoral votes. An incumbent president, 39 electoral votes. He got, third place. Third place. The progressive candidates got close to 70% of the vote nationwide. Yeah. Okay, so what happens? Well, that was a moment in time. It was the high point of progressivism in terms of their electoral sway. Yeah. I think what we see is a movement now that's populism matters because Republicans see populism as a way to shift that coalition. However, what they're going to find, whether Trump wins or not, Trump is still not going to get a majority of the popular vote. He may get a majority of the electoral vote, but not a popular vote. Yeah. And if you look at it, they're gonna have to deal with the hard truth of, okay, you're still a plurality at best. Likely a minority. I think, like you mentioned, there's more evidence that Harris wins the popular vote but could lose the electoral college. Yes. You're still the smaller of the two coalitions. Yeah. That is not a winning formula. Right. Trump won in 2016 because, he got the inside straight. Yeah. Like, congratulations. Yeah. But that is not the recipe for success moving forward. You much rather be where Republicans were in the 1970s and 80s, 1976 notwithstanding, which was a very, very close election. They need to make some shifts. Right. That means that they have to entertain the populist wing that's rising in the Republican Party. But I think you're more likely to see that populism kind of becomes some parts of the Republican Party, but isn't as talked about in the post-Trump era, whether that's 2025 when Harris is inaugurated, or 2029. I think when, so I think that it is a real element. I think that there are left and right-wing populists. I think that populism has always kind of been part of the political conscience here in the United States, but I don't think it is the future of either political party. I think it can help either political party grow their coalition. Yeah. It's not going to be who they are overall, because I don't think that's what a lot of them want to be. You listen to a lot of Republicans or people who talk to Republican elected officials, and they say they can't stand Trump. Yeah. I genuinely believe them when they tell them that, and they hope and wait for the time when Trump is gone. Yeah. Not that they disagree with everything Trump says. Yeah, it's always the his policies are good, but like I don't like him. Yeah, and some of them would say, like, I don't like your policy. I don't like your tariffs.
That tariffs, the big one.
I don't like some of the, immigration policy.
Yeah,
Deport them all. I
that's
don't know if I
true.
like that.
Yeah, the rhetoric.
But, border security, I'm with you.
Yeah.
There are things in there that these Republican officials can agree with that they're going to talk about, but they're going to maybe move away from some of the explicit populist appeals. But we're trying to keep those voters in the fold.
Right. So, I mean, like, I think you saw that when the primaries were going on. I think that Trump was the populist candidate, and then you had a few other candidates that were running, trying to beat him as the more like traditional Republican. I think Nikki Haley was an example of that. And there's a reason why she was the last one standing against Trump, is because there's this desire to go back to like the Mitt Romney era of Republicanism and the George W. Bush. But I think whether Trump wins or loses this could be the death for a little bit of this rising populist movement in the Republican Party. In the Democrat Party, I think when Bernie Sanders lost in 2016 and 2020, I think they're going back to trying to be, even Vice President Harris, who was voted at one time to be the most liberal senator, has kind of stayed away from that part of it and tried to be a little bit more moderate and take. So I think you see that in both parties, where it's just trying to go back to the middle here, where you have these sections of it that are so extreme. But I think that lives and dies with the re-election, the dependency on if Trump gets re-elected or not.
And it won't be an immediate end, right?
No.
So even if Trump loses, he's still going to be an influential figure in the Republican Party. He's still going to, I think, dictate some of the rhetoric that the Republican Party has, and some of their policy positions. What I do think you'll see is people might be more willing to vote for somebody else that just isn't necessarily as populist. Still could have populism elements. So I think of someone like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. They ran. I mean, Ted Cruz ran as a conservative Republican. Rubio ran as kind of the traditional Reagan, Bush Republican in 2016. Great. If both of them run, you're going to hear populist rhetoric from them. If Trump loses, they're going to run for president in 2028. That populism doesn't just automatically go away. It may be toned down. It may be rebranded. They may mix some things. But I think what's important to note is I'm not so sure the Republican Party of Reagan, I mean, it's not coming back. Like the coalition of Romney is not going to come back.
No.
That Republicans should view that as, in some ways, a good thing. If you've been able to add a group over here and you can still get some more people from over here, get them back to the party, then you might have a bigger coalition.
Right. But if he loses, do we, like the Republican Party, I think you saw this in 2022, is that there was all this talk about the red wave is coming, the red wave is coming in 2022. I remember that very clearly. And they underperformed
significantly,
very badly in 22. And then everyone's like, oh, this is it for Trump. He lost in 2020. He lost in the midterms in 22. I think Ron DeSantis, who has a little bit of that, what you're mixing in with the, I think he's a perfect example of what you're just talking about, like kind of like a traditional Republican, but also mixing in that populist kind of agenda in there. There was a lot of momentum that he was probably gonna compete with Trump to win that primary position, and I died out as quickly as we said it. But I think that's a perfect example, because I think if Trump loses, people are gonna go right back to where we were in 22, where it'd be like, I don't know if this is the right way for the Republican Party to win.
Yeah, it does. It does create that uncertainty, and it poses questions like, what do we do next, right? And I think when you take a look at 2022, like one of the issues you run into from the Republican Party standpoint is, they underperformed in many places, especially in the Senate, because the candidates were not trusted by the electorate, right? And I think it came down to a couple things. Number one, Trump maybe was a bit sloppier in his endorsements, right? I'm going to nominate people that agree with me, that are, MAGA, but MAGA doesn't fit every single state. I'm going to nominate people that are election deniers. And so, you end up with a situation where people just look at them like that. No, I'm not. Like, there are a sizable number of Republicans that are going to say, like, nope, I'm not voting for Carrie Lake. I'm not voting for, J.D. Vance on that one issue, even though I'm not traditionally a Democrat. And so it'll be interesting to see, like, if Trump loses, where does the Republican Party go from there? You cannot, as a Republican Party, just say, okay, good riddance, see you later, Trump. It's not going to work that way. But you do need to have a conversation about, okay, what do we do that makes us more competitive, that grows that coalition? Now, what's interesting is that after 2012, of course, the Republicans had that conversation, and they said we need to be, better at reaching out to minority voters and women. And ironically enough, in 2016 they nominate Trump, who was like, I don't really care. Yeah. But then at the same time, what happens in 2020? They make improvements among minority voters, right? And so it's happening, but it's not happening by necessarily pandering to groups. It's maybe because of the policies, whether it's immigration or whether it's the pandemic or whatever it might be, just convincing them like, hey, we are pro-worker enough to, in the sense that, you are going to, with your economic positions, populism, whether it's because of social positions, they made gains. Like, that's really interesting to me. So, there's an irony of like people just like, well, Trump, way to go, Republicans. You thought you got somebody, you wanted to improve among minority voters, and then you nominate Trump. Well, guess what? 2020, he did something like that. We'll see about 2024.
I think going along with that point, I think for the Democrats, if they lose this election, they need to go back to being like the party of the working class, which is, I think they've gone away a little bit from that. And I think that used to be like their thing. Like all these unions, they used to endorse Democrats forever.
Right.
Like, are withholding their endorsement because people there in their unions are like saying, I'm probably going to vote for Trump.
Right.
And so I think they need to, if they lose this election, I think that's their point in the crossing road, is looking and saying we need to go back to being party of the working class.
So this is interesting because you think about the coalitions that existed, right? So you look at the Democrats who, outside of 1976, they lost in 68, 72, they lost in 80, lost in 84, they lost in 88. Like those 5 out of 6 elections, and most of them, 68 and 76 were very close. The rest of the elections, blowouts. I mean, just Reagan won 49 states in 1984. Bush won.
Looking at that electoral map,
it's absolutely crazy, right? Bush won significant, not as big as Reagan did in 84, but Bush won big in 88. Yeah. What Clinton starts is, okay, guys, like, we can't be the same party that we've been. Mm-hmm. We have to shift. Under Clinton and under the economic growth in the 1990s, he was able to tap into socially liberal voters who are economically conservative.
Yeah.
And those voters do exist.
Yeah.
But again, goes back to my element of Newtonian physics here. There's an opposite reaction.
Right.
And so as the Democratic Party becomes more friendly to some of the wealthier people, the corporations, they start alienating some working class voters. Mm-hmm. You take a look at some of the elements of whether it was the pandemic response, whether it's pro-climate policies.
Yeah.
The new wave of Democratic voters, urban elites, wealthier, college-educated, master's degree and above voters, many of them are the ones that can afford the policies. Mm. I'm not sending my kid to a private or to a public school. Yeah. I don't care if the Chicago city schools are closed for a year and a half and doing virtual.
Yeah.
My kid's not suffering.
Right.
I don't mind if I have to buy an EV. I can afford the EV and I can afford the charging station in my home.
Right.
Well, okay, great, but the person that doesn't have as much money, that's working class, whether it's white working class or Latino working class, they can't.
Right.
And so, like, this is part of that I don't want to say alienation, because there are plenty of voters, white, and Democrats are going to win a majority of the Latino vote this year.
Yep.
But that's why we're seeing some of these shifts. It's like, it's progressivism for me because I can afford it.
Right.
But you can't.
Yes.
But you should still vote progressive. And it's like, okay, but like, it's kind of hard to afford that, and we know inflation, who does it hit hardest? The people that don't have as much.
Right.
There are just elements out there in public policy where it's like, okay, like, is this really the best for the working class, or is this going to benefit the wealthy or the entrenched corporate interests? You see this pushback among Republicans on, no, we don't want tax cuts for corporations. We want it to be fair. And we want everyone to have, okay, oh, well, that's a different message than you were giving me under the Bush administration and under Reagan. Interesting. Like, again, it's not a wholesale shift, but it goes to what you said. Like, if the Democrats lose, they have to make a decision. Do you continue to move forward as kind of the pro-wealthy elite party? Or do you say, let's get back to our roots as a working class FDR coalition? Yeah. That's the tension that they're going to have to come up with. And there's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be trade-offs not only in terms of voter coalitions, but also in the electoral college. it can benefit you in Georgia, but it's going to hurt you in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
That's a tough. How do you make that trade?
Final question. Today, October 11th, who do you think wins? If you were to pick right now who wins the election, who wins?
So I got asked this a couple times last week when Pete Williams was on campus. I remember having dinner with him. He's like, all right, Professor, who do you think is going to make your prediction? So I'll say this. I think it's extremely close. We've talked about that. I think that, I've made predictions in the past that have gone horribly wrong, and, such is life.
No pressure.
So many people ask who's going to win. I'll answer by saying this. At this moment in time, I would rather be Harris than Trump.
Okay.
I'd rather be Harris for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think her path to the Electoral College victory is a little bit broader. I think Trump has a finer line.
Yes.
Second, she's demonstrated that opinion about her is more malleable than Trump, where things have been locked in. Now that can work in her favor. She has a higher ceiling because she's being able, as we talked about earlier, to convince people who may not have viewed her favorably before, now they do. So I think I'd rather be Harris. I think it is still hard to win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. I know it happens. It happened in 2000. It happened in 2000. It happened in 2016. But it's still not the norm.
Right.
And if you're up in the popular vote, it's hard. You, as the opponent who wins, you've got to run that inside straight.
Right.
So I'd rather be Harris than Trump. And I will also say this. Usually what we see is that the battleground states tend to fall predominantly one way or another.
Yeah.
So are we more likely to see somebody get over 300 electoral votes or somebody win like 272 to, 268? I think we're more likely somebody to get 300 electoral votes.
Interesting.
So if somebody wins Pennsylvania, that
probably wins Michigan and
Wisconsin.
Michigan and Wisconsin.
And if they win Georgia, they're probably going to win
Nevada, Arizona.
Yeah. Now we have seen that, for instance, North Carolina has split, where it's been a battleground state in 2008, 2012, in 2016, in 2020. It's voted Republican every single time.
Yeah.
Democrats have been very close.
Yeah, very close.
But so that's one state that has a penchant for going against where the other battlegrounds might fall. But I do, typically they kind of inch one way or the other rather than being split down the line. Now, I could be wrong in that, right? But historically, that's what we've seen. So I think we're more likely to see that 303, 309, 312 electoral votes for one candidate, even if the margins in those states are very narrow, it kind of breaks one way.
Thanks, Swearingen. Thank you so much.
Toby, pleasure.
Thank you all for watching this episode of the Toby Talks podcast. If you found this conversation to be engaging and insightful, I would ask for your subscription, and I can't wait to share with you the other conversations that I have coming our way. Again, I want to thank you all for watching. Please leave a like and a subscription if you haven't done so already, and have a wonderful rest of your day.